After World War II, the winds of change swept across Africa. More than 300,000 Arabs and Africans had fought for France. Tens of thousands were killed. And in the aftermath, a political awakening surged across the continent. In 1960 alone, 17 African nations declared independence from their colonial rulers. 13 of them broke free from France. These newly independent nations, mostly in West and Central Africa, saw an opportunity to unite their limited resources, to forge a symbol of Pan-African pride, to take to the skies. Together, they created Air Afrique, a global aviation company like no other. The founding countries included Ivory Coast, Senegal, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Niger, the Congo Republic, Benin, Central African Republic, Chad, and Gabon. Their mission was bold: to connect their capital cities, to open routes not just across Africa, but to Europe, Asia, the United States, and beyond. Because under colonial rule, transportation has served one purpose: extraction. Railways, roads, and ports were designed to export goods and wealth out of the country, not connect African people to each other. But with Air Afrique, the narrative was about to change. There was a need for these countries to be able to connect, not only between themselves, but to other parts of the world, said Kofi Songpon, a former Air Afrique technical staff member. Air Afrique was officially founded on March 28, 1961, but its story began earlier. In February 1960, it was first conceived as a subsidiary of Air France and UAT, the Union Maritime de Transport, to support regional transportation in Africa. By September 1960, it was officially registered as Air Afrique, and in October 1960, leaders from the Francophone world gathered in Abidjan, Ivory Coast. President Félix Houphouët-Boigny recommended the formation of a multinational airline, an ambitious step towards African unity. 2 months later, at the next conference in Brazzaville, 11 heads of state stood in agreement. They would build this airline together. Not everyone joined. Ghana, Gambia, and Mali had their own visions, and Soviet allies to back them. But for the rest, the dream pressed forward. At the third conference held in Yaoundé in early 1961, history was made. The Treaty of Yaoundé, signed on March 28, 1961, officially established Air Afrique. It was a joint venture. Air France and UAT held 17% of the company, while the African nations owned the remaining 66%. They contributed 500 million francs, the equivalent of around 10 million USD today. This alliance gave the airline the wings it needed. Among the early pioneers were Leopoldine Douala Bell Smith. She was the only qualified African working in aviation at the time. And in 1960, she became Air Afrique's very first employee. A symbol of pride, a symbol of change. By June 25th, 1961, the airline had appointed its first CEO, Sheikh Boubacar Fall. And just 2 weeks later, on August 1st, flights began. Using 12 leased Douglas DC-4s from France and UAT, Air Afrique launched its internal routes. Demand soared. By October 1961, flights to Paris had begun, with a few stops along the way. And soon, the fleet upgraded to Boeing 707s and Douglas DC-8s, aircraft fit for intercontinental travel. Then in June 1962, Air Afrique joined the International Air Transport Association, IATA. Think of IATA as the United Nations of aviation, enforcing global standards for safety, ticketing, communication, and operations. That same year, in October, Air Afrique signed a commercial agreement with Lufthansa, the East German airline, extending its reach even further. By January 1963, Air Afrique was already making waves in global aviation. Its first CEO, Sheikh Boubacar Fall, was appointed general manager of the company, guiding the strategic evolution from the inside. Later that year, in October 1963, a major merger occurred. The Union Maritime de Transport, or UAT, merged with the Transport Aérien Intercontinental, forming UTA, Union de Transport Aériens. As a result, Air Afrique's ownership structure began to shift. A new player entered the picture, SOTRAF, the Société pour le Développement des Transports Aériens en Afrique, acquired a 28% stake. The remaining shares stayed in the hands of African member states. In October 1963, Air Afrique received its first DC-8 aircraft. By November, it was already in the skies. A second DC-8 arrived in January 1964 and was soon deployed on the popular route to Marseilles. And by November 1963, Air Afrique had done what few African airlines had managed. It owned its entire fleet, following a landmark agreement with UTA. That same year, Hajj flights began. Using the Lockheed Starliner, Air Afrique carried pilgrims across the skies to Mecca. fulfilling both a sacred and symbolic role in the lives of African Muslims. It wasn't just an airline. It was a bridge to the world and a path to the divine. In April 1964, Air Afrique gained authorization to operate transatlantic flights between Africa and the United States. And by November, the flagship Paris-Abidjan route added a stop in Geneva, Switzerland, marking another step in its expansion. By April 1965, the airline employed 2,500 people. The fleet included 2 DC-850s, 3 DC-4s, 4 DC-6s. In that same month, the Paris-Dakar-Geneva route added another stop at Robespierre, Liberia. Momentum kept building. In May 1965, the airline placed in new orders: 2 Caravels, a 3rd DC-8, a convertible DC-8F designed to increase cargo capacity. The DC-8F would arrive in 1966, replacing older DC-6s. Also, in 1965, Togo became the 12th state to join the consortium, though it wouldn't fully participate until 1968. And by the mid-60s, Air Afrique took over the Air France and UTA maintenance facilities at Dakar Yoff Airport, a major technical hub. There, they serviced aircraft for Air Mauritanie, Air Senegal, and even neighboring air forces. A secondary maintenance center was established at Douala Airport, though more extensive repairs were still held at Le Bourget in France. Air Afrique was becoming more than an airline. It was a continental institution. In September 1967, the company received 2 Caravelle 11Rs, a hybrid passenger cargo version of the iconic Caravelle 10R. To afford the new aircraft, 2 DC-4s were sold. The Caravelles were deployed across African routes, replacing the older DC-6s, and in 1968, another DC-850 joined the fleet. By then, Air Afrique's network spanned 22 African countries, several French cities, including Bordeaux, Lyon, Marseille, Nice, and Paris. It was also in Geneva, Switzerland, and New York City through an agreement with Pan Am. In February 1970, Air Afrique expanded again, ordering 2 McDonnell Douglas DC-1030s, wide-body jets that would define the next chapter. Later that year, they added a 3rd DC-10 to the order. Tourism in Africa was on the rise. And in March 1970, Air Afrique acquired a 51% stake in the Société de Développement, signaling a growing interest in hospitality and travel agencies. By April, the company's workforce had reached 3,750 employees. The fleet had grown to include 3 DC-8S, 1 DC-8F, 2 Caravelle 11Rs, 1 DC-3, 4 DC-4s. In December 1970, another aircraft joined the skies, the long-range DC-8 63CF. That same month, 2 Namic YS-11As, turboprop airliners, were also added, though they would be transferred to Air Ivory by 1972. With the DC-863, Air Afrique began direct flights to New York on its own authority, but success didn't come without turbulence. In August 1970, Jean Bedel Bokassa, president of Central African Republic, announced plans to withdraw from the consortium to launch Air Centrafrique. The plan was eventually shelved. Soon after, Cameroon's president Ahmadou Ahidjo also voiced dissatisfaction. Frustrated by the lack of Cameroonians in senior leadership and by the airline's headquarters being in Abidjan instead of Douala, the busiest African city in the network. In 1971, Cameroon withdrew, founding Cameroon Airlines on July 26th. Ownership of Air Afrique was restructured once more. The remaining shareholder countries each now held 6.18%, with Sotraf retaining 28%. Despite the shakeup, Air Afrique kept soaring. That year, a 3rd Caravelle joined the fleet. The regional headquarters for Central Africa were moved from Douala to Libreville, Gabon, a move that angered Chad's president, Francis Tambalbe, who also threatened to leave. But Chad ultimately stayed. By 1973, Air Afrique joined the Air France reservation system, integrating into global booking network. And then, a new flagship was born. On February 28, 1973, the first wide-body DC-1030 named Libreville was delivered. It touched down in Dakar, Senegal on March 2nd. And by March 13th, it had replaced the DC-8s on major routes, including Paris, Bordeaux, Nouakchott, Dakar, another route from Paris, Dakar, Abidjan, another route from Paris, Fort Lamy, Banjul, Brazzaville, and Paris, Marseille, to Niamey, to Cotonou, to Abidjan. Later that year, Air Afrique purchased a 4th Caravelle from Royal Jordanian Airlines, and a new Douglas DC-855F joined the cargo fleet. And in 1974, leadership changed hands. After more than a decade at the helm, Sheikh Boubacar Fall was succeeded by Awusu Kofi as the new head of Air Afrique. Through the 60s and 70s, Air Afrique grew from a dream into a global brand. One jet, one passenger, one connection at a time. By March 1975, Air Afrique had become one of the most significant multinational carriers on the continent. The airline had grown to 3,726 employees, and its fleet now included 3 Caravels, 1 10R, 2 11Rs, 1 DC-3, 5 DC-8s, including the DC-863CF, a DC-830, and 3 DC-850s, and a single DC-1030. Later that year, in August, a second DC-855F was purchased, bringing the cargo fleet to 3. And in 1976, a second DC-1030 named Cotonou joined the skies. Interestingly, the aircraft had arrived in June 1975, but was temporarily leased to Thai Airways before becoming a permanent part of Air Afrique's fleet. But not all partnership would last. That same year, Gabon withdrew from Air Afrique Consortium, launching its own national airline, Air Gabon. Still, growth continued. By 1978, Sierra Leone had joined the consortium, another sign of the airline's Pan-African aspirations. In 1979, Air Afrique made a bold move. It replaced an order with Airbus, 1 A300B4 meant for the Dakar-Paris route, 2 A310s. Eventually, the order was standardized to 3 Airbus A300B4Ss. That same year, a Boeing 747 fighter was also ordered, signaling the airline's growing ambition in international cargo transport. By the early 1980s, a powerful change had taken root. Africans now held all the top administrative roles in the company, a policy known as Africanization. It was a post-independence ideal, an effort to reclaim control from colonial legacies and entrust leadership to African professionals. But not everyone saw it as progress. Critics argued that the vital industry expertise was lost in the transition, and over time, those cracks began to show. Suleiman C. Savni, who would later star in films like Goodbye Solo and Machine Gun Preacher, worked for Air Afrique as a flight steward from 1995 to 2000. He recalled, "Most of our clientele were African when I was there. I think it was an element of pride for them. It was a pretty sought-after position, a pretty prestigious company. We were being paid very well." In 1980, the airline boosted 5,100 employees, a fleet including 2 Caravel 10Rs, 3 DC-850s, 2 DC-850Fs, 1 DC-863, and 3 DC-1030s. The airline served 22 African nations and connected them to major international cities like Paris, New York, Geneva, Rome, Marseille, Lyon, Bordeaux, Nice, and Zurich. 3 new aircraft were also ordered: an Airbus A300B4, an Airbus A310, and a Boeing 747-200F. But financial turbulence was on the horizon. In 1981, Air Afrique sold a DC-855F to make room for incoming aircraft. That year, it received 3 Airbus A300Ss, a Boeing 747-200C, and its third DC-1030, named Naimi. To keep up with rising costs, the airline sold off 3 Caravels, 2 DC-863Ss. By the 1983, things had changed. Passenger numbers were dropping. Flights became overbooked. Schedules were missed. Some flights arrived a half a day late. Others left hours ahead of schedule, without explanation. Unpaid ticket reserved by member states were becoming a financial drag. In 1983, the airline reported a loss of 68 million French francs. In 1984, another 6.8 million francs in losses. For context, Air Afrique had made 17.6 million franc profit, or 2.47 million USD, just a year later in 1985. A passenger volume that rose to 757,000, a 9.5% increase from the previous year. But behind the scenes, debt was growing. By early 1985, total debt had reached 250 million, and about 1/5 of that came from unpaid dues from the member states. Rising food prices made matters worse. In 1978, the airline spent 35 million on fuel. By 1984, it had nearly doubled to 63 million. Director General Awusu Kofi pointed to other problems too: overstaffing, economic stagnation in many member countries, stiff competition from airlines like UTA on European routes. In 1985, Ivorian executive O.C. Kofi was replaced by Anx Ekonga, a former head of Hydro Congo, the Congolese state oil company. Ekonga had a tough mandate: cut staff by 515 people, reduce salaries, sell one of the Boeing 747s for $60 million USD. By July 1986, the airline's debt-to-equity ratio had climbed to 8-1. Total obligations hit 1.8 billion French francs. The feat, meanwhile, included 3 Airbus A300s, 2 Boeing 727s leased from Air France and JAT, 2 DC-8s, 3 DC-10s. That Boeing 747 cargo jet meant to be sold eventually went to Korean Airlines for $60 million. By the late 1980s, the financial pressure on Air Afrique had reached dangerous levels. The airline had racked up over 200 billion French francs in debt. The once celebrated symbol of Pan-African unity now stood at a crossroad. Desperate for support, the member nations, including Benin, Burkina Faso, the Central African Republic, Chad, Congo, Ivory Coast, Mauritania, Niger, Senegal, and Togo, turned to France for assistance. On March 2, 1989, the French government stepped in. Roland Billicart, a senior French official, was appointed chairman and CEO of Air Afrique, the first non-African to ever lead the company. Billicart arrived with a controversial plan to save the airline, cut 2,000 jobs, and streamline operations. In 1988, Air Afrique carried over 710,000 passengers, but ended the year with a net loss of 288 million French francs. A year later, under Billicart's direction, the airline posted a modest profit of 7.3 million francs, equivalent to 1.3 million USD today, and carried 754,000 passengers. By June 1989, the workforce had already been reduced by 1,600 people. To protect airlines' survival, the new leadership lobbied against foreign competitors, pushing for restriction that favored Air Afrique across its members' nations. New destinations were added too, including Agadez and modern-day Niger later that year. And to reinforce its operations, Air Afrique leased a 302-seat Lockheed L-1011 from American Transair, a 137-seat Boeing 737 from Air Maritime, and a Boeing 707 freighter from Naganagami. The numbers improved. The soul of the airline was beginning to shift. Despite its struggles, Air Afrique never lost sight of its mission: to uplift the people of Africa. Its pro-African ethos extended far beyond the skies. One of those lives changed by the airline was Kofi Songopon, born in Togo, who joined Air Afrique in the mid-1990s through a college graduate program. Air Afrique was the company that gave me a chance to start my career in this industry. I didn't have enough means to attend a foreign aviation school, but they gave us a scholarship, trained us, and guaranteed us jobs. I wish more companies in Africa or anywhere in the world would invest in young people like that. Air Afrique gave opportunities that many Africans would never have otherwise imagined. It wasn't just a job, it was a dignity, it was purpose, and it was family. It also became known for something else: safety. In 1995, after a tragic crash involving Cameroon Airlines killed 71 of 76 passengers, the New York Times called Air Afrique a rare beacon of reliability in one of the world's most dangerous aviation regions. One of the victims, German journalist Wolfgang Schmidt, had considered flying Air Afrique instead, but ultimately chose the shorter route, a choice that proved fatal. By March 1990, Air Afrique's fleet consisted of 3 Airbus A300B4Ss, 1 McDonnell Douglas DC-863F, 3 DC-1030s. That same year, an order was placed for 4 Airbus A310-300Ss, with 4 more options. Deliveries began in mid-1992. Meanwhile, Air France had acquired UTA, becoming its controlling shareholder. As a result, UTA's stake in Air Afrique passed into Air France's hands. In 1991, the first Airbus A310-304 entered service. By 1994, the airline had grown to 4,200 employees and maintained a fleet of 12 aircraft. But then, disaster struck. In 1994, the CFA franc was devalued by 15%, drastically reducing Air Afrique's cash reserves. As the airline defaulted on its debts, 1/4 of its fleet was seized. From that point on, many of the aircrafts had to be leased just to keep routes alive. Flights were canceled, frequencies reduced, and code sharing became the new normal. In 1995, the airline transported 761,000 passengers, but lost 19 million, the equivalent of nearly 40 million today. Later that year, DHL began investing in the airline, looking to stabilize its cargo operations. In February 1996, one of Air Afrique's DC-10s were sold to AOM French Airlines, a quiet signal that the airline was beginning to sell off its legacy. In 1997, Roland Billicart left the company. He was succeeded by Sir Harry Tervergodum, a Mauritian national, who became the airline's director general. Billicart's tenure had been marred by accusations. He blamed the member governments for interfering too much. Employees blamed him for worsening the airline's debt by purchasing 4 Airbus A310s, but under Tervergodum, some stability returned. He reduced the debt to just 31 billion francs. Yet only 3 countries, Ivory Coast, Mali, and Senegal, contributed their fair share to help. Out of a 20 billion CFA recovery plan, the rest of the members remained silent. Air Afrique partnered with the World Bank, scaling down its operations to focus only on Afrique. In July 1998, the airline reduced its fleet from 15 to 11 aircraft, returning 4 Airbus A310s to their creditors. But even with these measures, the airline financial health continued to decline. By the end of that year, Air Afrique's debt had risen again, this time to $300 million, the equivalent of nearly $580 million in today's currency. Ownership was also fragmented. CFA zone countries held 70.4%. African and French investors owned 13.7%. Air France held 12.2%. DHL held 3.2%. By January 2002, the dream was finally grounded. Air Afrique, once a proud symbol of African unity and possibility, ceased operations. A month later, it was declared bankrupt. 6 aircraft were repossessed, and a decades-long vision of independence, progress, and connectivity quietly unraveled. For a generation, Air Afrique represented more than just an airline. It was a hope in the skies, a declaration that African nations could build something together. Yet, its collapse marked the end of a crucial chapter in Africa's aviation history. In the vacuum left behind, other African carriers rushed to fill the gap. And while the airline was no more, its people remained. Many former employees found work in aviation across Africa, Europe, North America, and Asia, carrying with them the knowledge and passion once nurtured at Air Afrique. Kofi Songkwon, a former technical team member, put it best: "The legacy they left is tremendous in terms of qualified aviation workers in different fields." At its peak in April 2000, Air Afrique had 4,440 employees, a fleet including 2 Airbus A300-600Rs, 3 A300B4-200Ss, 2 A310-300Ss, 5 Boeing 737-300Ss, a Boeing 767-300ER, and 2 Airbus A330-200Ss on order. Its route map stretched across the globe, from Abidjan to Abu Dhabi, New York to Nairobi, Rome, Lisbon, Dakar, Johannesburg, Paris, Geneva, and Zurich. Air Afrique connected over 35 cities across Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and North America. In January 2001, aviation veteran Jeffrey Erickson, former CEO of Trans World Airlines, was brought in to restructure the debt-ridden airline. Backed by the World Bank and consultants, a 14-month plan was announced, but time was running out. By June 2001, despite still ranking among the top 5 African airlines, Air Afrique's debt had ballooned to $431 million, the equivalent of $765 million today. To avoid collapse, the airline appealed to Air France, then a minor shareholder. In response, Air France raised its stake to 35% after a cash injection. The 11 African governments dropped their ownership to 22%. Employees held 5%, with the rest owned by outside investors. But behind closed doors, Air France's true plan began to surface: shut down the company and create a new airline using the same name. That plan never materialized. And in the shadow of 9/11 attacks, the aviation world entered free fall. By the end of 2001, Air Afrique had just one operational plane left, and a workforce of 4,600 people serving a fleet that had nearly vanished. Though Air Afrique was widely regarded as one of the safest airlines in Africa, it wasn't without tragedy. Its first major accident occurred on May 3rd, 1963, when a Douglas DC-6B crashed into Mount Cameroon, killing all 55 people on board. In 1987, tragedy struck again, but this time in the form of terror. On July 24th, a DC-10 flying from Brazzaville to Paris was hijacked by a militant. The hijacker demanded the release of his brother, imprisoned in Germany. While refueling in Geneva, he shot and killed a French passenger. A flight attendant was also wounded. Eventually, Swiss police stormed the plane and ended the standoff. Through triumphs and turbulence, Air Afrique's story remains unforgettable. It was the region's largest and most reputable carrier, and it did so while displaying its Africanness as a point of pride. It built careers. It trained engineers, pilots, stewards, and executives. And most importantly, it gave a generation of Africans a reason to look up and dream. But in the end, mismanagement, political interference, and a changing global economy brought it crashing down. Even employees were left wondering. Our planes were always full, packed 90% of the time. So I never really understood, how did we go broke? And as one African diplomat told the Washington Post in 2001, we never thought the airline would be run so badly that it would be easier and often cheaper to fly through Paris to another West African capital than to use Air Afrique. Something is very wrong. Air Afrique is gone, but its legacy lives on. And in the skies it once conquered, and in the hearts of those who still remember its wings. It was more than an airline. It was a symbol of freedom, of unity, of what Africa could become when it flew together. And maybe, one day, we'll fly that high again.